Thank you for being here. Today, I am finally bringing you that review. So, I've got two books that I'm going to review today, and neither of them are fiction, neither of them are fantasy. But I think it's important that we read widely. So, nonfiction, fiction, literary fiction, fantasy, science fiction. Children's literature is often very beautiful. I will be reviewing some children's literature that I find to be very full of heart and, excuse me, that was my coffee, and very full of truth. So, but for now, today, I am going to be reviewing Guyana Legends and Braiding Sweetgrass. So they actually kind of have a theme, which I didn't set out to make a theme, to do this review, but they ended up with a theme. So the first one, Guyana Legends, is all about the folk tales of the indigenous Amerindians, which are the native peoples of South America. And Guyana actually happens to be where my family of origin is from, as well as Suriname and a couple of other places in South America. And we have a very big Amerindian heritage. And so I really wanted to delve into some of that kind of folklore because I don't see it anywhere. I didn't know anything about the stories they used to tell each other as children. And as immigrants, my parents came over, and I don't know if this is true, if any of you have family, that came over and immigrated to America, and they don't really talk so much about where they're from. They will, talk about the food that they ate, the manners that they had growing up, respect for each other, but they don't really talk about like the stories of it. And I'm not sure if that's because, and maybe it still is this way now, that there's a lot of stigma of people who come from other countries, that they are lesser than, or that they're not intelligent, which is total bullcrap. But they really didn't talk about that, and we very much were raised as Americans, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. But as I am getting older and really looking at history and looking at myself and my identity, I realize that's a really big hole for me. I don't know that part of my history. And so I've been doing some research, and what's very interesting is that these stories that are in here are what they were able to collect, this gentleman, Odin Ishmael, from oral traditions. But very similar to how when my parents came here, they were very much assimilated. The native peoples, when they were colonized by Britain in that area of South America, they assimilated. They did not fight, at least as far as I can tell from the histories that I have read, and I still have to do more. But it's very much that those cultures assimilated so that they did not have to suffer consequences that would basically wipe out their people. And so a lot of those oral traditions were gone pretty much overnight, and there is very little left over from the Amerindians in that area because the people were so willing to assimilate. But also, conversely, that meant that that area has such a rich culture. It's very diverse. You have people from the Caribbean Isles, you have people from China, you have people from Brazil, and you have Hispanic peoples, you have Creole, you have African, it's an Indian people, and like from India, not the fake India. But yeah, so all of those people, it's like a melting pot, and the people there, you can see it in their culture, you see it in their food, you see it in their offspring and their heritage. They're very unique people when you look at them. And so when I would read fantasy, I always, for me, thought it was odd that that the races were so compartmentalized. And I recently listened to a YouTuber, and I don't remember the name, which is fine because I'm not that type of person. I don't put people on blast. And I'm sure he has more experience anyway than I do in this. But he was talking about the fact that modern fantasy, when they're putting things like on TV and they're trying to mix in races, that it doesn't feel real, because in reality people are extremely homogenous, which is very true of European cultures and maybe even, European, Asian, African cultures. But in this region, that was not the case. There were, in my family alone, I have people that are from the British Isles that have very light skin, light hair. I have people that have very dark skin. And I have people that look very Indian, some people that have a very Asian look to them. And this is just in my family because of all of the mixture. And it is like the antithesis of what a homogenous society is. But they identify as Guyanese. They identify as Surinese. They see themselves as Caribbeans because they are it's on the coast, by the way, the northeastern coast of South America. So there's a lot of trade that goes on there with Trinidad and Jamaica and, all of those beautiful islands. So there was a lot of mixture, but they identify themselves as a people despite the mixture of nationalities and ethnicity. So that was my rant on that. But that was my reasoning for picking up these books and really wanting to delve into these peoples and their beliefs, and also just their folklore and the stories that they told each other. So in this book, it is a collection of different stories, and they all are connected. So very different than when you go to read like Grimm's fairy tales. Those are very compartmentalized stories. So you have Cinderella, Snow White, you have Rapunzel, you have a witch story, you have a cobbler story, but they're not necessarily interconnected. But these are. And so it tells the story of how the first people came to Earth, and then it tells another story about an alligator. But then the characters, the people or the animals that were in the first 2 or 3 stories may show up in another story later on. So you don't have to necessarily read them in order, but all the stories connect, which I thought is very interesting because of the way the Amerindians responded to colonialization in that area, and because of the way that they are very mixed people, that despite looking different than one another or having a different skin tone, or somebody might look white and the other person looks black or Indian or Chinese, they still identify as one people. And I can kind of see that in their story, because their stories aren't like here, 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 here. They're interconnected. And the stories, a lot of them actually feature animals. So the animals are the main protagonists of the story, and the lessons that are taught throughout that story teach you how to work with nature, how to respect each other, how to be giving and not stingy. Like, those are the types of lessons that are in this book, which is very, very neat. But then it also just tells these beautiful, whimsical stories that are just quite delightful. So, Guyana Legends. You can go ahead. I found this book on Thrift Books. I buy many books on Amazon, but I also just really try to go in person to my local bookstores when I can. And Thrift Books also, I like to, kind of support secondhand books, that type of thing. So it's really neat because it's got a map with the original names of the different regions And then throughout it, it has different pictures. I mean, it's not the highest quality, but you get it. You get it. So that's really great. So get this one if you want. And now the next one I'm going to tell you about is Braiding Sweetgrass. This is, I want to say, one of the most beautifully written books I have ever read. It's by Robin Walker Kimmerer, just my R's, and it is all about what it says: indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plants. So she is a native North American, and she talks about in this book the stories that were told in different tribes of the native peoples, and she talks about how they relate to the nature and weather, and how the stories really help to teach people how to live with nature and to treat it the way nature should be treated, as a sister, as a brother, as a mother, as an aunt, as a father, as a child, because nature is a living thing. There is sentience there. And we are a part of that sentience. And it is my firm belief that we have forgotten that. And that is why we're so sick. That is why we're like so anxious and stressed out all the time, because we don't belong all the time in four walls. We belong out in the woods, or walking the rivers, or swimming the ocean, climbing, the rocky walls by the sea. Some of us are desert people. I'm not, but some of us are. So reading this book really spoke to me on a very deep, spiritual level. And let me just read one little part for you. In this, she talks about the harvest, and this is particularly, she's talking about leeks. And how she writes it here is: eating leeks is a spring tonic that blurs the line between food and medicine. It wakens the body from its inner lassitude and quickens the blood. But I have another need too, that only greens from this particular woods can satisfy. Both my daughters will be home for the weekend from their far places where they live. I ask these leeks to renew the bonds between this ground and my children, so that they will always carry the substance of home in the mineral of their bones. I mean, you can't say it any better than that. What we eat becomes a part of us, and we are the elements. And if we're not getting those elements in our bodies, of course we're going to be sick. Of course we're going to feel depressed. Of course we're going to be anxious. Because we're not communing with the land the way we're supposed to. And when I say communing, I'm not talking about, dancing naked under the woods, under the full moon. But if you want to, that's your thing, go for it. But what I am saying is that eating raw foods, eating the foods that are indigenous to where you live, are very important, because they contain the stuff that keeps you well, that boosts your immunity for that area. Here we have plantain that grows naturally in the grass, and I harvest it over the summer. And plantain is great because as a dried leaf, you can make a tea out of it. It's good for pain relief, but also is anti-inflammatory, especially good for vitamin C in the winter when you need that vitamin C. Now, of course, I can always go to the store, buy a vitamin C tablet, and that's fine. Or go get oranges, because you can get oranges nowadays from anywhere. Even if you live in Alaska and there's no oranges in Alaska, you can still go to the store and get an orange, I think. But we live in a world where our food is very commodified, so we don't necessarily have the appreciation of why certain foods grow in certain areas and what they do for the human body. And we've disconnected with that. And so if you want to learn about the native plants of North America, if you want to learn about there's research in here they've done about monocropping. There's research about even like harvesting. Like, do you just cut it, or do you pull it all out by the root? Like, scientific research that has been done that talks about best practices, things that back up the way people used to live and work with the land instinctively, and then they told these stories of how to do that in the way we tell stories of fantasy, and it's very beautiful. Now, that is not to take away from any religious beliefs of indigenous peoples. I'm not saying that all their stories were allegory in any way, because that would be pedantic and highly reductive. But I am saying that there is an element of that in those stories, and there is something to learn from that. So these two books I highly recommend. I go through this book every so often. It's just beautifully written, and I also have it on Audible, so I'll listen to it while I'm driving, or I'll listen to it sometimes if I just can't get out of my head, even if I'm on a walk. It calms me and it brings me back home. So I hope you guys enjoy that. I hope you're drinking whatever your tea is, and my admonition for this video is to let it be. Let go of the stress, let go of the worries. If there's anybody bothering you, let go of that too, and just be you and find your way home. So with that, I will say goodbye. Thank you again for joining me. I'm Victoria Camden, a writer with a work in progress.